All right, so Spencer, you recently lived through a historic event in New York City where, the proponents of alternative voting systems have been clamoring on their forums, on their email newsletters about the idea of ranked choice voting and how it's going to solve all of our political ills, reduce polarization, reduce the tendency for negative campaigning. Like everything is just going to be fantastic. And so New York City recently ran a mayoral primary with ranked choice voting. Did ranked choice voting live up to the hype?
Did
What do
it
you
solve
think?
all of our problems?
Yeah, sorry, is everything fine now?
Yeah, let me back up just a little bit and maybe explain what ranked choice voting is for the people. So I'll explain how we did it in New York because I think it's probably a good and simple version. So let's say that there were 12 candidates for mayor this year. What New York allowed you to do is it gave you five spaces to rank up to five of them, right? So I would choose, my number one, two, three, four, five. And so what happens then if in the first round of them counting the votes, no one gets a majority of the votes, then the person who got the least number of votes, that person's eliminated. And everyone who chose that person is first. Then we see what their second choice was. And then we allocate the votes to that person, right? And we keep going until somebody gets a majority of votes. And so I don't know how simple that sounds to people. It sounded simple to me, but as you were saying, we found out that actually got a little bit more complicated than that for a number of reasons. And so, do you mind if I get into those?
Oh yeah, totally, right. So just to clarify, right? I mean, it's essentially it's repeated runoffs is kind of what happens, right? It's like you have the first round and then you eliminate someone and then you run another round of the algorithm without the lowest vote getter in the first round. Is that correct?
Exactly. And so some people actually call it instant
Yeah.
runoff. And so if you were following the Senate races in Georgia, right, they Georgians voted for senators in November, and then no one got a majority. And under Georgia state law, then they had to run this runoff 6 weeks afterward, right? And actually, that flipped the outcome. The two senators, Republicans who were winning, ended up losing. And so, runoffs, there are a lot of problems with runoffs. And that's another reason why people like this instant runoff system, right? We kind of just do that work like of a primary and a general, all of it together.
Totally. Totally. Yeah. Cause I mean, I can imagine how anything like that could seem like sketchy or weird or confusing or like there's something nefarious afoot. Whereas if it's just all part of one process, then it's maybe a little bit more intuitive.
Yeah, I mean, you'd be surprised right now. Anything in voting, someone will say is sketchy and nefarious. And actually, Eric Adams, the mayoral candidate who is leading right now, was for ranked choice voting, then came out against it.
All right, we're back after an early error and a little kick out, but we're going again. So Eric Adams.
Yeah, so unfortunately, everything in voting right now seems sketchy to some people. And so Eric Adams was originally for ranked choice voting, and then he came out against it. He and some other ostensibly progressive members of the city council were saying that it disenfranchises voters of color. That is not what the research shows. The research actually shows that this system helps elect, especially women and candidates of color. Um, but they were pointing out in kind of their own way that the Board of Elections did not do a good job of educating voters on this system. So, this is a pretty big change, right? If you go to a polling place and you expect to do it the way you've always done it, and now you have this grid with five spaces, it can be confusing. And so part of the problem was that our election in November, right, the presidential election did not use ranked choice voting. And so the Board of Election was telling a lot of groups in the city, like the League of Women Voters, do not start publicizing ranked choice voting yet because it's going to confuse people because they're going to assume we're using it for the presidential. But then we had special elections for city council in February and March. And so that was obviously a huge turnaround time, right? The presidential election ends kind of, right? It lingers forever. And, everyone is absorbed by that. And then you have the elections in Georgia that are kind of consuming everyone's headspace. And then, somehow the city needs to tell people in Queens that their city council primaries are going to be using this entirely different system. So, the Board of Elections fucks up nonstop. This actually wasn't that much of their fault, right? They're kind of in a bind that this was going to be implemented like right on the heels of the presidential election. So that was the big problem. And so people were pointing out like, this is going to confuse voters. That doesn't seem to have been the case. Actually, a lot of the exit polls show that voters were really happy with the system. They're really excited to use it. Uh, but what what happened is the Board of Elections released preliminary data that was incomplete, and they knew it was going to be incomplete because it takes a long time to receive and process absentee ballots. And so, to me, I don't understand why we ever release data that is incomplete. I don't think you should be able to until the vote is certified, but that's something else. So they knew the data was going to be incomplete, but then Eric Adams' campaign is looking at it, and it looks like there are about 130,000 ballots that are included in the total that shouldn't be there. Uh, and what the BOE realizes pretty quickly is that they were using test ballots to test the system, to test the accuracy of the vote counting machines, and they didn't clear them from the tallies, right? So again, just like a colossal fuck up, they just didn't hit the clear button, and so that hasn't helped the situation, right? You had this system that people were already critical of, that seems confusing, that there had to be all this outreach on, and then you have a situation where the lead between Eric Adams, the mayoral candidate in first, and the second place opponent really narrows. I think it's like 12,000 votes now, less than 2%. And then it's also not final, right? And so people are already talking about litigation, and it is a mess. But again, I think it's important that we separate that kind of the mishandling of the logistical side of it from ranked choice voting itself, which is something that is very popular and for a lot of good reasons.
No, totally. Yeah, that there's a conflation that can happen where it's like, okay, these are the kind of like standard bureaucratic problems or human errors that occur with any sort of like large entity trying to manage like a messy human based system, right? I mean, we're obviously in a year of seeing that during a pandemic, right? Where, you can go back and look at many decisions made by the CDC or the World Health Organization or any number of governments. And, just sort of like people reading blogs on the internet can be like, that seems really stupid and wrong. And they were right, right? It's like,
Yeah.
I read 3 blog posts on this. How do I know how to make a better decision than the CDC about like how testing should be regulated? And it's maybe a somewhat similar situation where you have these errors, but it's not necessarily an indictment of the process itself.
Yeah, it should be an indictment of the Board of Elections, which should truly be abolished and built from scratch. In November, they mailed out 100,000 absentee ballots to the wrong address. The executive director was caught not disclosing that he is on the advisory board for a major voting software company, that the state has paid millions of dollars to. They purged voters in 2016 from the primaries, and then they admitted that they had broken federal and state laws. The Board of Elections is a truly horrible, inept organization in New York City. And, conservatives point to this and they say if this were happening in Georgia or Texas or Florida, people would be losing their minds. And they have every right to say that, right? It's happening in New York. Democrats control New York, but like the voter suppression here is bad. It is bad, and it doesn't even need to be intentional, right? It can be through their incompetence and nepotism, but it still has the same effect, and it's wrong.
Totally. So if we kind of zoom out then and say, okay, cool, like we have these institutional failures, right? We have this rotting, sclerotic bureaucratic institution that is making, obvious mistakes and maybe some in bad faith, some in just an incompetent way. But if we think about, okay, ranked choice voting seems like an okay idea. Maybe it was confusing to people, but it sounds like it actually was not that big of a deal. I mean, what is your take on, despite all the problems that are currently happening, how did it go?
I think that it went well. I usually work the polls. I didn't this election. I wanted to talk to the voters and see how they were handling it. Again, the exit polls I've seen suggest that people did a good job, or that people understood. I think it is intuitive, especially if someone is there explaining it to you. And I think ranked choice voting, what I think is so noteworthy is that it really has bipartisan appeal at a time when nothing in elections does. And so I believe that it is Virginia. The Republicans just use it to select their gubernatorial candidate. It is being implemented almost across the board in Utah. It is in Alaska. Now voters just pass a referendum. It's in Maine to choose their federal offices. So, the people love it. And again, as we were talking about earlier, it makes sense why, right? You avoid these like costly runoffs that no one votes in anyway. And it gets you to a candidate that most people feel like they can accept. And so, Maine kind of pioneered ranked choice voting at the state level because they consistently got governors who had like 41, 42% of the vote, right? And that's not what you want. You don't want politicians who don't have a majority mandate. And so I think some people maybe overemphasize this because I think that we had to go through 11 rounds of voting or of tabulation in New York City for the mayors, right? So I think 10 or 11 candidates ended up being eliminated. So a lot of people's ballots are exhausted, meaning that all 5 people they ranked, none of them are going to show up as the last 2. And so, do those people feel like they're being included in the process? No. But also, this is an election, right? Someone needs to win. Some people are not going to get their first or second or fifth choice. And that's kind of the name of the game. But in general, it helps select someone who most people feel good about. And it allows third-party candidates to run, right? You're not wasting your vote. There's no prospect of, you vote strategically. It really allows you to vote based on what you care about. And that is kind of the point, right? That is what we would agree democracy should be.
Yeah, so something you started to mention there, which I think is one of the better arguments in favor of ranked choice voting, is that compared to the sort of like standard first past the post voting method, which most of us are familiar with, right? Which is just like, okay, whoever gets the most votes in this election is going to win, sort of like you mentioned, whether or not they have a majority. The people have an incentive to not vote for someone who they don't think has a serious, realistic shot of winning, right? So as you said, people are accusing each other of throwing their vote away if they vote for a third party candidate. It happens every presidential election. People are like, oh, I hate both of these buffoons, but like, what am I going to do? Throw my vote away and vote for the Libertarians or vote for the Green Party or whatever, right? And in a ranked choice voting system, you can rank your preferred candidate first, but not throw your vote away, quote unquote, because you can put one of the people who may have a more realistic shot of winning, second, third, whatever, so that as that iteration cycle happens, your vote counts for that person. So I guess, did that actually happen in this mayoral election? Did that incentive actually work?
It's hard to say because the polling beforehand was so confused. So the polls I was looking at seemed to suggest that it would be Andrew Yang, the former candidate to be president for the Democrats, and Eric Adams, the guy who's currently leading, that they would be the 2 frontrunners. Andrew Yang, the night of the election, conceded, right? It was so clear that he just didn't have the votes. And so I don't think anyone was getting above 23% in those polls. So it was tough to say, who is the kind of third-party candidate long shot and who is the frontrunner. But I think we definitely saw coalitions, especially at the city council level. And so there were a lot of races with, 8, 10, 12 candidates. And you would see, the 3 or 4 progressive ones saying, rank me 1 or rank me 2, rank this other person first or second, right? And so proponents of ranked choice voting had said that. They said it would lead to nicer campaigns. It would lead to this kind of cooperation. I was very skeptical of that, especially in New York, where there is so much money. And, I think we saw a lot of negative campaigning being outsourced to other groups, to super PACs, right? But I think that we also did see, that kind of cooperation, or at least, alliances of like-minded candidates uniting in a way where at least one of them would be elected. And again, right, if that's what the voters in their district want, that's a good thing, right? That the progressive vote was not split 5 ways, that, could coalesce around the candidate that best represents the constituents.
Yeah, totally. And sort of like you're mentioning, that's one of the other arguments in favor of ranked choice voting, is that the incentives for politicians themselves should be better, right? Because again, in a first past the post system where there's one round, one winner, everyone else loses, it's a zero-sum game, right? It's like, okay, everything I can do to get a vote or take a vote away from you is on the table. And if I don't do it, someone else is going to, and I'm going to lose. Whereas in a ranked choice system, right, I mean, there's still obviously a winner at the end, but the incentive to try to push other people away or take votes away from them isn't quite the same. As you mentioned, it's like, hey, listen, like, I'm actually like pretty close to this person over here. So maybe they're your number 1, but like, who are you going to put number 2? It's going to be me. Right. And so it makes sense theoretically. And it does sound like that happened at least partially. To ask him, I guess, a more clear question about that. One of the things that is theoretically supposed to happen in a ranked choice system is there should be less polarization, right? Because there's not the incentive to reach to the most extreme motivated voters who do tend to come out for things like primaries or like off presidential cycle elections, who often have like extreme ideologically driven views that may or may not conform to what people as a whole want. Did that tend to happen, or was that not really the case?
We still don't know. We still don't know who's been elected. I think maybe it's half the city council races haven't been called because we have to go to these next rounds of tabulation. I would say uh, a system that I think is perhaps better at achieving that is it's called Final Five. And so Final Five is ranked choice voting, but it's also an open primary. So, many states, New York included, you have to be registered with a party in order to vote in its primary, right? So you have to be a registered Democrat to vote in the Democratic primary. Under Final Five, that's not the case, right? All the candidates are in one election, and then any voter is able to vote for them, and then they are ranked the top five. And so this is being pioneered in Wisconsin, actually has a lot of bipartisan support. Uh, and so I think, under that system, I think that will help combat some of this extremism. But I also think that we have to recognize that there are extreme views in this country, right? Marjorie Taylor Greene is an extreme ideologue, and she was elected by the voters in her district. Under a different voting system, would they have chosen someone else? Yes, maybe, but also this could be the person they want, right? And, people will say the same thing about AOC, is that she is an extreme version. And is that necessarily a bad thing? I mean, it obviously depends on what your political preferences are. I would say, does it reflect the will of the voters? That to me is the only question that we can answer with any kind of objectivity, right?
Yeah, so I guess if you were to try to kind of parse that out, where it's like, okay, you have these two kind of like culture war figureheads, right? That they're at least purposefully playing the game a little bit to rile people up, and then also, they end up being a hot button, whatever, like lightning rod for the opposing side to generate turnout. That the idea would be that, okay, that type of polarization is actually maybe not the best way to get multiple people from different coalitions to rank you somewhat high, right? But it might be the best way to get the 30% of people who are highly motivated, who are going to come vote, to vote only for you. And yeah, I mean, I guess it kind of depends if you think about like the set of voters who are going to potentially turn out in an election, like what percentage of them are going to resonate more with like, extremist culture warring.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is undeniable that primary voters are not representative of the electorate at large, and they definitely skew more partisan. Uh, but at the same time, I just don't know if that extremism is bad necessarily. When people are saying we want politics to be more civil, I think about just the ridiculous views that are being represented in the House of Representatives right now. And the fact that Marjorie Taylor Greene has a position of authority, right? To me, that is horrifying. And I'm not upset for people to rightly call that out, right? So I think that politics ideally would be civil, but sadly, we don't live in a particularly civil time, right? And there are such clear and vibrant divides between us that, of course, our campaign season is going to reflect that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, because there is an element of like, okay, if this is what people want, then no matter what the voting system is, that's what they're going to get, right?
Yeah, and I think that especially with election reform and voting systems, people project their own desires onto it, right? So if I tell you that ranked choice voting helps third party candidates, you are going to think of the third party candidate that you support, right?
Yeah.
And so maybe that's the Green Party. And if it's the Green Party, you're not thinking about, some Proud Boy racist shit, right? But like that person is as equally to benefit from ranked choice voting as the Green Party candidate. And I hope that people keep that in mind, is that we can't just design elections for voters how we think voters should be or how we want them to be. We have to deal with how they are. And, a lot of voters, it is unfortunate to say, but are low information. They decide very late. They are easily swayed by things like television advertising, by who their friends vote for. A lot of voters lie about having voted. You can ask them, and in surveys, you routinely see that 15% of voters tell you they voted when they really haven't. And so I think that that isn't great. That's not ideal for a democracy, but we just have to recognize the limitations of voters. And I think once we start talking about voting restrictions, this will come up again in just terms of what is reasonable to expect of an otherwise busy person to participate in our society.
Yeah, totally. And this idea of just where voters are at, I think is so interesting and is just such an important part of any of discussion like this, right? Because it's sort of bi-directional, where you have candidates who are trying to appeal to voters, right? So candidates need to do things that voters like. And then the behavior of candidates, especially since they're prominent people featured in the media regularly, et cetera, then that dictates what voters are interested in and thinking about, right? So you run into these same kinds of problems with any kind of marketing situation where it's like, oh, people like junk food, so companies make junk food, then companies
Right.
get better at making junk food, which makes people like junk food more. So you end up with these like feedback loops that just kind of kick off crazy stuff happening.
Yeah, it's tough, right? And the issues that most people are focused on, like cancel culture, like critical race theory, are not the most important issues, I would say, affecting our society, right? And the races that people are most concerned about, the presidential race, probably not the politician who's going to affect your daily life most, right? Things like zoning laws certainly affect you more than if Dr. Seuss book is canceled or whatever that was, right? But that's not how we operate. Like, we are emotional people. Our politics are based in emotion. And so again, is that ideal? Probably not, but like that is what it is.
Yeah, totally. So I mean, I guess, it sounds like the New York race, like it's crazy, chaotic, lots of back end problems, but it does seem like, at least empirically, some of the theoretical positives of ranked choice voting have borne out. Is that true?
Yeah, I would say so. I think something else that I'm watching in the city is there was a bill introduced in the city council to allow non-citizens to vote. That's something that happens in school board elections in San Francisco. It happens in a few jurisdictions in Maryland. Uh, and that is certainly something that I would say I have mixed feelings on. It has a lot of support from the progressive left. I certainly understand why. People are here as permanent residents. They work, they pay taxes. Should they have a say in how the city is governed and policed and taxed? Like, I certainly get that. But I certainly see the arguments on the other side as well. So, New York City is going for a lot right now. There are a lot of changes both at the city and the state level.
Yeah. So if you were to say, okay, these are the things that I would like to see in the next election based upon how this one has gone, what would those be?
In terms of ranked choice voting.
Yeah, right. I mean, it sounds like, okay, this went all right. Other than tear down the election board that can't do anything right.
Oh no,
What
that
would
was
you like
it.
to
That's
see?
all I've got to
Okay.
say. Just
Yeah, get
appoint
rid
me
of the.
director of elections and really burn that one to the ground. Honestly, I would say that's it, right? We can always do more to educate voters to make sure that materials are available to them, that they're available to them in the languages that they read and write most proficiently. Uh, that we have, qualified and competent poll workers. I think one of the craziest things about New York elections is if you want to be a poll worker, you need to be there at 5 a.m. and you need to leave at 10 p.m. Under state law, they cannot break it into shifts, right? And so that discourages a lot of people, right? It's a shitty job with long hours on a Tuesday. Not many people can do that, right? And so there are a lot of like really kind of boring structural factors that would maybe get us better, more qualified poll workers who then could explain these things better, right? There is no silver bullet. It was never going to be ranked choice voting, though I think they did. And we ended up doing a good job with ranked choice. And I think, we'll see how it goes in subsequent elections, but I am happy with how it went.
Yeah, and I think that what you're saying there is a really good point, that it's easy to underrate the just kind of like nuts and bolts of like, okay, what are the poll workers literally doing? Right, that stuff matters. And it's really easy for it to go wrong or to never have been set up properly in the first place. So, I mean, you mentioned some stuff about, languages that people may speak, et cetera. Are there other things that you think are key, like little reforms like that would make elections go better?
I'm sure there are a million. I'm not thinking of any right now. You're just having interpreters on staff. Again, though, it's so difficult to predict, right? Especially in a special election where you have turnout of 7%. And it's like, yeah, we should have an interpreter there all day just in case, there is an influx of, Chinese speakers or Farsi or whatever it may be. But then typically that person is just waiting around for 16 hours. right? So they don't feel like they're doing anything. They're probably not that likely to come back again. And what is it? I think it's $300 for the day. And so that is not negligible, right? That is a lot of money to some people. But if you want to attract a certain caliber of poll worker, if you want to attract, say, lawyers, can you offer bar credit for working the polls, right? Can you incentivize city workers to do it? Like again, just a lot of ways to figure it out.
Yeah, totally. So we started to talk about some, culture war issues have thrown a few things out there, and it seems that voting rights itself has become something of a culture war issue, right? I mean, obviously there's the whole election fraud situation, but in response to that, there seems to be some pushes to essentially restrict voting rights, make it more difficult for people to vote, put up more hurdles, close certain avenues that people have of voting. And, for myself, where I tend to be mostly on the political left with most things, right? This at first seems like, wait, what's actually going on here? This doesn't seem reasonable. However, I do often think that there is, you can make like a good faith argument for most political positions that people hold. Not that everyone who's making those arguments actually believes them, but I guess I'm curious, what is like a good faith steelman argument in favor of some of the voting rights restrictions legislation that is coming up?
So the theoretical argument would be that it is imperative that we ensure that only eligible voters are casting votes. I say that's theoretical because there is no and there has never been evidence that that is not the case. And so the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank, keeps a database of all instances of voter fraud. You can go and look at it. Considering the millions, tens of millions, billions of votes cast, it represents truly a negligible number of cases. And so to me, we cannot escape that fact, right? That any argument that you're presenting has to acknowledge that this kind of fraud does not exist. So that does not mean that we shouldn't be concerned about determining the eligibility of voters. I would say, to me, the fundamental question is who should bear the burden of that? Should it be the voters themselves or should it be the government? And I think that it should be the government.
Yeah, totally right. So with most things, there's some sort of like government process you have to go through in order to be allowed to do the thing, right? It's like, okay, should people have driver's licenses, right? Like, I guarantee you there's some anarcho-capitalist forum poster right now who's like, do not tell me
license.
do not tell me who can and can't use the road. But most people are like, yeah, I mean, that seems okay. Like, I understand why that's a thing that we make people do, right? And for voting, seems plausible. Like, okay, yeah, we don't want literally anyone to be able to go anywhere and vote at any time. Like, sure, that's too far in one direction. And then there's another end of the spectrum where it's so restrictive and difficult that almost no one is actually able to complete the process, right? And it's like, okay, where's the sweet spot for making sure that there's some structure to who's voting and who's not, and where does that actually lie, right? Based upon what you're saying, it sounds like the amount of voter fraud is negligible, so that slider can sort of go more in the direction of like, hey, we don't need a lot of restrictions on this.
Yeah, and I think it's important for us to think about why it is that fraud is negligible. And so the kind of fraud that is usually presented to us, I would say there are two kinds. There's absentee, vote by mail fraud, and then there's in-person fraud. And let's deal with the in-person first. So how it is presented is that someone would go and impersonate the identity of someone else and then vote under their name, right? This is a very difficult and high risk thing to do because you have to know that that person hasn't already voted before, right? So you have to be able to identify who it is that you're impersonating and then impersonate them and then do it on a scale that it actually makes a meaningful difference. And so that is just really difficult to coordinate, right? And especially because even in states without photo ID or strict photo ID, there are still measures, right? So when I'm a poll worker, when people come up, they tell me their name, I ask them to confirm their address, and then they sign the poll book. And if their signature doesn't look like it matches, then I can flag it. And I have flagged it before, right? It has been totally off, and I've forced them to sign an oath saying, under penalty of perjury, I declare that I am the person who I say I am. right? So it's not like there are no safeguards in place. That person's identity has already been verified when they registered to vote, and then they are in the poll book and they have to provide some means of confirming that they are who they say they are. And so this in-person fraud just requires a complete breakdown in all of those systems, and again, at a scale that would make a meaningful difference. And so I think we just need to recognize that that is an unrealistic scenario. For the absentee voting, people would say maybe it is a little bit easier. And again, the most common system is signature match, right? So you fill out your ballot, you put it in the envelope, you sign it, and then it's the same process. The Board of Elections looks at it, they confirm the signature on file, and that's how they verify the identity. That isn't great. People's signatures change. People don't realize that it's going to be confirmed to the database. And so, they just kind of fuck around, right? Like you would to sign a credit card at a restaurant. And so I'm not saying that signature is the best method. I don't think it is necessarily. Georgia passed this pretty restrictive law, and a feature was that you had to provide the last 4 digits of your social security number and or a photocopy of your ID. I don't necessarily hate that, right? I think we could come up with a system that is better than signature matching, but is not as onerous as providing a printed photocopy of your ID, right? Who has a printer in their home? I do, but that's insane. No normal person should. And so, again, there are better ways that we can do it. It is just difficult for me to take conservatives seriously, knowing that they've made these bad faith arguments and knowing that they have already question the legitimacy of elections that are beyond reproach, like the 2020 election, right? And like how large of a faction of that party still says that there was widespread fraud when we know that there wasn't.
Yeah, totally. And I guess something I am curious about, being in Chicago, is there's many tales of extreme voter fraud and ballot stuffing and political machine interference in elections, throughout the 1900s in a place like Chicago, right? And a lot of this is done probably before really solid records are being kept. Is there truth to any of those kinds of rumors? Like, is that something that anyone has like really said, like, okay, yeah, this totally happened, right? The dailies just like did all this stuff.
Yeah, I can't say definitively. I think that to me, the most convincing argument why we need to have a secret ballot is because then you can't sell your vote. So the only way that vote buying, selling works is if you can prove to the person that you ended up voting for the person that they paid you to vote for, right? And so if you can't do that, then the system kind of breaks down. That being said, there were huge political machines in Chicago and New York, and they promised people favors in exchange for votes. And I'm sure that still happens. Again, it's difficult because where do you draw the line, right? These voters are voting for the people they think best represent them. That is what we say you should do. It's obviously complicated kind of by this like slimier part of it, but like politics are like that. Obviously, we shouldn't be striving for that level of corruption, but like to me, that is very different than saying that Democrats are busing undocumented people from poll site to poll site in California and then somehow having them vote in each location.
Yeah, got it. And I guess I'm just trying to think about, okay, like what would be a good faith way to disagree with like, this election fraud just like doesn't exist. And I mean, yes, I'm thinking like, okay, you're telling me that in this recent New York election, that the people who were in charge of voting just forgot to clear out their test, right? Like these people are fucking stupid. They can clearly like change the numbers and they obviously don't know what they're doing. Like, yeah, maybe there's no documented proof of these instances of fraud happening, but like we can see right here that they can change the numbers if they want to, and they just forgot to when it was like an obvious thing that they should have done. So what's to say that they couldn't just be like, oh yeah, just kidding. Like it is this now, right?
Yeah,
I mean, I guess that's like, I can imagine someone thinking that in a reasonable way.
Yeah, and I agree. So part of the reason the BOE is how it is because it is mandated again under state law that there's an equal number of Democrats and Republicans. So each borough has 2 chairs on the board, 1 Democrat, 1 Republican, and then everything is similarly structured. So when I work the polls, I'll be at a table with a Republican counterpart. And so that is a system that people have devised as a way for there to be oversight, right? And so I would say structurally that is built into the system. So that is not just one person from one party pressing the clear button or pressing the vote total button. And so I understand people's trepidation when they see these fuck ups because it's like, oh, well, it seems like you have a lot more power than you've told us that you have, or you're doing things that should be impossible. Again, voter fraud is probably the most investigated thing in our political system at the moment. The incentives to discover and expose voter fraud are so high that people will just tell stories. Like, this is a myth that you hear after every election. Jurisdiction X had more votes than registered voters in the jurisdiction. You hear this myth so often, and it's always a different jurisdiction. And it's just like, you think that no one noticed that until 5 days after the election. It's, they're just always using, census data from 10 years earlier, right? There's just always like a very easy explanation. But these myths and this disinformation always rely on the fact that no one is paying attention. And that couldn't be further from the case, right? Political parties, Republicans especially, have tens of thousands of poll watchers out there looking for any mistakes. They are combing over this data. Again, like, if you're going to elect a president, that is something that you have sunk so many resources into, and you think that just like no one is checking websites or like doing any due diligence. Again, they're just so unfathomable to me that it's embarrassing that we have to take these things seriously.
Yeah, I got it. Right. And there's obviously some people who are going to make arguments like that in bad faith, where they know like what the actual deal is with the census data, but simultaneously they know that if they put it out there, most people aren't going to bother to go and look like, okay, what year is this census data from? Like, let's compare that to the ballots from this year. Like, okay, yeah, that's why, right? That most people are just going to see it and freak out.
Absolutely. In Georgia, you were seeing people saying that every Democratic voter was being mailed an absentee ballot. That was not the case. They were being mailed an absentee ballot application. Again, voting is complicated. It seems like something that's simple, right? Oh, it's one person, one vote. But when you dig into the details, it gets very, very complex. And so it's easy to get confused, and it's very easy to confuse other people.
Yeah, for sure. So we started to talk a little bit about voter ID, right? Which again is kind of like a very hot button issue. And my half-baked understanding of this, again, just a person who has read a few blog posts and listened to a few podcasts, is that voter ID doesn't actually seem to make that much of a difference in either direction, right? That it doesn't seem to do a whole lot to eliminate voter fraud, nor does it seem to do a whole lot to actually stop people from voting. So it seems like an interesting spot where it's like people are really mad about this and arguing about it, but it just like kind of doesn't seem to move the needle too far one way in either direction. Is that your understanding as well? What am I missing?
Yeah, so let me start with the argument that I always present to conservatives, which is that voter ID, one, we've already talked about how the fraud doesn't exist, but the real argument for them is voter ID laws are incredibly, incredibly expensive. And the reason is the Supreme Court has found that if you are going to require people to have an ID to vote, then you have to provide those IDs for free, or it's an undue burden. And in a lot of cases, you have to provide the underlying documentation. So if someone doesn't have a birth certificate that they need to get a voter ID, all of that needs to be free. And then you need to make those voter IDs more accessible, which usually means opening satellite sites or like having mobile units that can make these accessible. And we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars, right? And millions of IDs. And so, again, I use this with conservatives, right? Because conservatives often talk about fiscal responsibility. To me, this is a great example of how we are just burning money to solve a problem that doesn't exist. So that's one thing. The second thing, in terms of turnout to me, I think, is a very unreliable metric of the success of an election for a lot of reasons. One, there are a lot of confounding variables. One just being the political culture, right? Minnesota's had the highest turnout rate for presidential elections, I think, for like the last 4 cycles. They just have a culture of voting there. And so people show up in a way that they don't necessarily in other places. The competitiveness of the race, the amount of money spent, right? A lot of things can affect turnout. And so it's very difficult for us to say it is because of this strict photo ID law that it went up or down. Also, I don't think we should talk about turnout in aggregate, right? We should talk about turnout for specific groups. You have an ID, I'm guessing. I do. Everyone I know does. But that's not the case, right? Do you want to guess at the number of people who have a driver's license? What percent of people, of adults?
Well, that's a tough question. Interesting. So it's probably lower than someone would think, right? So let's go with 40%.
Oh wow. Okay, so it's I would say it's higher than I thought. It is about 90%. But what
Okay.
that means is that 10% of people don't have a driver's license. That doesn't necessarily mean they don't have an ID or an ID that would be acceptable under these laws. It doesn't mean that they're in states where these laws exist. But if 10% of people don't have an ID, that's a lot. And again, this is your right. This is your right to vote. And so again, it's who should bear the burden of this. Should it be people having to go get an ID, even if it's free? Or can we devise some other method of ensuring that eligible voters vote and no one else does?
Yeah, I got it. And so, I mean, what do you think would be the best way to make sure that eligible voters vote and no one else does?
I'm actually talking to someone, Tammy Patrick from the Democracy Fund, next week about this. And again, I don't know. In elections, I think that there are a lot of places, reasonable places for disagreement. For example, should we structure boards of elections so that there are an equal number of Democrats and Republicans? Is that a good way to ensure that there is oversight? Maybe, if we use New York as the example, obviously not, but it's like, okay, that is a function we should have, right? We should ensure that people running elections are somewhat neutral or that we mitigate their bias as much as possible. It is not a good look when the Secretary of State in Georgia is overseeing his own election for governor, right? As with happened with Brian Kemp in 2018. And so this is something that we should talk about, right? And like we should look at the data and we should try and make a decision of how we want to structure these things, how we should verify eligibility. And so I wish that those were the conversations that we were having and not, why is it that vote absentee ballot fraud is happening at unprecedented levels, right? Like we're just not able to help voters by having these conversations. We just really help, I think, radical people on both sides.
Yeah, and to that point, sort of like we've been talking about, right? I mean, it seems like there are all these different spots in the voting process where the system could be tweaked, or there's confusion between, different like government entities, or it may be difficult for voters. But those don't tend to be the spots that people are arguing about, right? People are arguing about these other areas that are inflammatory and potentially like getting folks riled up. But it does seem like there's a lot of low hanging fruit just throughout the entire election process that could just make things a lot better for everyone.
There is. And to go back to a point I was trying to make about turnout. So I would say we shouldn't necessarily talk about turnout. I think it is much better to talk about the cost of voting. And so an academic created something called the cost of voting index. I really encourage people to look it up because it ranks states by how difficult it is to register, to cast your ballot, to cast an absentee ballot if you need to. And I think that really gives us a window in just how disparate it is in this country and how ludicrous that it could vary so much from place to place. And so there is, this is in the For the People Act, the voting rights legislation that is currently being held up in the Senate, that there be same day registration. I was talking about maybe we overemphasize turnout, but same day registration is truly one of the best reforms you can make, right? So you show up the day of, you aren't registered yet. You have to bring an ID, right? You have to show that you are who you say you are because there isn't time to do these like kind of back end verifications. And then you're able to cast a ballot, a provisional ballot, right? And so then they take all that information on election night, they confirm it. And if you're eligible, your vote is counted. This is huge. This boosts turnout by 5%, which is honestly more than probably every other reform you can think of combined. And it really, really helps people who typically don't show up, like young people, poor people, highly mobile people, voters of color. And so, again, like this is such a simple thing. Election administrators probably wouldn't say it's simple. It takes a little bit more work on their end, but like it is very easy for us to understand. And Montana just repealed their same day registration, right? Which again, to me is such good evidence that Republicans are not concerned about integrity. This is something that people love, voters themselves love it, the convenience of showing up on the day, casting a ballot. And there are the security measures that Republicans love, right? They say that they want photo ID. And it's like, okay, well, same day registration, you're getting what you're telling us that you wanted. So why are you repealing it, right? Maybe because your concern is not people, not the security of our elections, but just discouraging people from voting.
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, there is this sort of floating idea out there, and I've certainly heard that there was an argument that some lawyer made, I believe, recently, where it's just like, oh yeah, actually we want to suppress turnout because that actually favors our candidates. Which it's sort of like, oh, interesting. Like folks are just going to actually come out and say that sometimes as well. So I mean, like, what do you think the distribution is of people who are good faith, seriously concerned about like, hey, listen, we have to just make sure the right folks are voting versus, we're just really trying to essentially like, we got gerrymandering over here, we got election laws over here. How can we jigger the system as best as possible to support the candidates who we want to win?
Yeah, there are those hot mic moments every year, very consistently. And I think it is unfair only in the sense that Democrats are doing the same shit, and obviously in different ways. But New York State used to have really atrocious voting laws up until 2019, right? In a lot of ways, it still does. To get same day registration here, we need to change our state constitution. You have to pass the bill in two legislative sessions and then send it to a referendum. That referendum is going to happen in November. Hopefully, it'll pass. The same thing with no excuse absentee. But my point is just that a lot of blue states also have shitty voting laws, and that politicians were elected under the voting system that currently exists, and so that's the one they trust, right? And so regardless of ideology, they are very reluctant to tinker with that at all. And I think Republicans have certainly chosen this hill to die on. But I don't want to give Democrats any leeway in thinking that like they are just righteously above that all, right? The parties want to do what they need to stay in power. Democrats gerrymander, Republicans gerrymander. Typically, Republicans are just better at it, but it doesn't mean that like no one's hands are dirty in this mess.
No, I think that's a really good point that you made, that the people who are in charge are sort of by definition the people who were elected. So even if they're like, okay, like there are some problems with this system, you don't want to start to mess with something that actually resulted in you winning. And you're probably going to try to do whatever you can within the system to make sure that you win again. Right. So there is that perverse incentive there.
There is, and I think that Democrats, especially now that voting has become such a hot issue, they fundraise off of this. And as a journalist, I try to be really aware that how I talk about voting laws does impact people, right? So if I give people the impression that in Georgia, you're not going to be able to vote, or it's going to be an 8-hour long wait, or that they're going to reject your ID, or that they kicked you off the voting rolls, that's going to discourage people from voting, right? And so we have to be really realistic. And so you hear like voting purges all the time, right? But what does that really mean, right? As we don't have a national registry of voters here, it's all done at the state level. And so people leave the state and they don't tell the state and they stay on the rolls, right? And so the states do need some way to distinguish between who is still a resident, who is still an active voter, and who isn't. And obviously some states are on the side of being very harsh and kicking off voters who ended up being eligible. But that is a process that does need to happen until we do a national registry of voters. And so if we're just always talking about purges and giving you the sense that voting is a fucking nightmare from start to finish, why would anyone go do it, right? I think we have to recognize that the majority of people are going to wait fewer than 30 minutes to vote. They are not going to have an issue. That does not excuse voter suppression in this country, which is obviously real and widespread and intense. But it does, again, we need to keep everything in perspective.
Yeah, we started to mention gerrymandering a little bit. Where does that intersect with the broader voting rights discussion, or just like election reform in general? And actually, we should probably briefly define gerrymandering for people too.
Yeah, gerrymandering is just the state legislature's ability to create the electoral districts and then in a way that favors them most. And so there are a lot of good video explainers. I can do it better than I can about just how you can have a minority of the vote, but end up with the majority of the seats in the legislature based on gerrymandering. Beyond that, though, that is something I don't understand that well. There was a case before the Supreme Court. Academics came with a formula that at the time I understood, but now I certainly couldn't repeat back to you about how you can tell if something is gerrymandered. But it's hard. The law is that you cannot create, let me see if I can get this right. You cannot create districts based on race. But race and political affiliation in this country are so intertwined that you can use partisan ID, right? and black voters vote Democrat about 96% of the time, right? So there are a lot of ways to get around these rules. Um, but that is definitely a problem with no clear solution, like certainly not one that I've heard. And again, I'm not an expert on gerrymandering by any means.
Yeah, it seems like a pretty intractable problem because almost any way that you would try to get rid of it, it's like, okay, well, you need some capacity to redistrict stuff, and whoever's in charge is probably going to figure out some way to redistrict it in a way that
Yeah, I
benefits
know a
them.
number of states have independent commissions that they use. And again, this is another place where we can all reasonably disagree, right? Probably it is not state legislatures who should be drawing their own districts, but then who should do it, right? And how can we ensure that those people are doing it in the fairest way possible?
Yeah, for sure. So let's do a hard switch here. We talked a lot about voting rights, gerrymandering, all that stuff. And then, before we started recording, you're like, an interesting uncommon intersection is voting rights and CrossFit, right? So I actually first became familiar with you from your writing for the Morning Chalk Up, right? So we both are CrossFitters. I own a gym. And you have recently written a book with Mat Fraser, 5-time fittest man in the world, an extreme accomplishment. And that book is coming out in a while. But what's the deal with that? Why write a book with this man? What does he want to say? Why do you want you to write it with him? What's going on?
Matt was actually kind of the perfect person for this. So, for a little bit of context, I started kind of my whole journalism career in 2016. And one of the first things I published was with Matt. It was like a pretty short interview in Men's Health. And then he and I worked together for about 4 years. And then I approached him with the idea of this book. And I say he's the perfect person for a few reasons. One, uh, he's very smart. He got a double major from the University of Vermont in engineering and one other thing. And so he is very smart and articulate. And he's also very self aware, but he would not really share any details of his life or his training while he was still a competitive athlete. And so he would never post his lifts on Instagram. He wouldn't talk uh, about some of the pretty horrific injuries that he sustained while at CrossFit. Sometimes at the CrossFit Games, he was able to hide things like tearing his LCL. Uh, and so it was very interesting then to kind of go back over these years and just learn that there was a lot going on underneath the surface that I was never aware of.
Yeah, and he was someone who was like, hey, I'm gonna keep, everything close to the chest because I don't want my competitors to know what's going on. I don't want them to know if I'm doing well. I don't want them to know if I'm doing badly. I don't want them to get ideas from my training. Like I'm trying to beat these people and they can't know anything about me, right? Is that kind of his vibe?
It's absolutely that. And it's funny because probably the other elite CrossFitter that I know the best is Noah Olson, who could not be more different, right? Who is just incredibly emotive and earnest. And they were going head to head in 2019. And it looked like there might be an upset that Noah Olson could have beat Matt. He didn't end up. But just in terms of personality, it was funny to see that it could be so different in two people.
Yeah, both competing at the highest level. So it's not like, oh, you got to be one way or the other.
Yeah, and that's really nice, because Noah Olson just like loves to meet with fans. We'll finish an event, he's in the crowd taking selfies, like really gets pumped up on that. Matt is just like as fast as he can back to the hotel room, towel over the head. His fiance would rent a house during the games for her and Matt's family, and so Matt would just have the whole room to himself. Right, is like a pretty introverted person, like especially when he was competing. Really an island unto himself. And so it was, again, so great to be able to talk to him, to hear what he was thinking in those moments when he was just so stoic. And he got that reputation in the community for being, stoic, maybe to the point of being arrogant or of being unfriendly. And again, that's not his personality at all. He is just someone who was like, this is my job and I'm not going to do anything to jeopardize it. Like I know what I need to be mentally and physically at my peak, and it is not to be super warm and affable in this interview.
Yeah, it's like I'm here to win. Like you guys want me to win, right?
Yeah, and he did. No one ever thought that someone could beat Rich Froning's record of 4 consecutive wins. Matt ended up with 5, at a time when the sport had progressed so far, when the level of competition was so much higher. And I think still now we do not fully appreciate what an achievement that was and how dominant he was in the sport. I think during the 5 years that he won the games, he earned like 83% of the total points, right? And this is a sport where consistency is everything. And he was just, I think he finished below 20th 3 times in 5 years or in 7 years, right? Just a level of dominance that I hope we don't see again. It is impossible for me to imagine someone being that much better, uh, especially when I'm not getting any better, right? I'm just getting worse over here. So I guess we'll see.
Well, so Matt retired and he's like, all right, cool. Like I was not telling anyone anything because I was trying to win, but now like here's what happened, here's what I did, here's how I hurt myself, here's my training. Like he's just like, yeah, cool. This isn't secret anymore. Is that the idea?
Yeah, and so we started under the condition that it wouldn't come out until he had retired. And then, I think what the hardcore CrossFit people will like is 100. I think we have about 100 workouts in there. They're all workouts that Matt did during his training. And I think that people can and should geek out on those. And then, just some behind the scenes stories and then just look into his mentality. Matt was able to balance this really kind of surreal combination of being terrified at all times that he had fallen off and that he was about to lose, and then also just believing that he was unbeatable. And again, two contradictory states, and he was just able to maintain them for so long. And it, just one of those seems exhausting, let alone both at the same time.
That's very insightful. I mean, anyone who has worked with any high level athletes, one of the first things that I think is very striking about that you may not expect is that level of neuroticism about performance, right? That's something that I think can be very toxic for athletes who are performing at a high level, but also seems to be just kind of like part and parcel of the process where it's like, hey, yeah, you have to compare yourself to other people all the time to do this thing. And people are trying to beat you. And if they win, you lose. So you need to be aware of that, but you can't let it consume you and take you over. So, I mean, it sounds like that's a big part of what you guys were discussing.
Yeah, and he said that he was very good about understanding what he could control and not worrying about the rest. I think that is easier when you win all the time, right? When I don't think he lost after like 2014. That was the last time he lost. So, it's easy not to kind of internalize that when the only feedback you're getting is positive and success. But I also really sincerely believe it. He's like, I just needed to feel like I had done everything. And if someone had beat me that day, then how could I be upset by that? Again, we never saw that play out. I think that he retired at the perfect time when he was undeniably the champ, when he didn't resent the sport in the same way. He had been in the OTC, the Olympic Training Center, to go to the Olympics for weightlifting. He broke his back. He broke both sides of a vertebra. And then that functionally ended his career. And then he kind of came back and he was just running on spite and resentment and then ultimately bowed out. So, he left that sport kind of in a really bad state. And I think that he learned a powerful lesson from that. And he didn't want the same thing to happen with CrossFit. And so I'm really impressed that he didn't continue, because he probably could have trained not that hard and won another one, or, certainly been on the podium and just like continue to shine in this success. Because like you were saying, for athletes, it is difficult, this mentality, and then to turn it off when you stop competing, right? To like just totally flip your worldview. And I think that he's done a good job now of just channeling it into different things, this book and his supplement company and just other projects that he's doing, because, it is a wild way to live. And then it just ends one day.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. That, I mean, like you mentioned, you sort of have this psychotic, like narcissistic blend of like, I'm the worst person in the world, everyone's going to beat me. Actually, I'm the best person in the world, no one can beat me. And then you retire and you're like, oh, I don't need to do that anymore. I don't have to like be in this like constant up and down, like simultaneous superposition of these insane mental states. Like what happens to someone when that turns off?
I don't know, because it's also just the boredom. We see Matt at his most glamorous at the games, but then it really is 11 months of doing nothing but eating and sleeping and training. And I competed on American Ninja Warrior on season 7, in 2016. And so for 3 weeks, I was on a very similar but much, much less intense training schedule. It was a fucking nightmare, right? It is so boring, and the monotony of it is just really kind of sucks the happiness out of every day, and not being able to control what you're eating, and just like being tired and having to mobilize. And that was his life, right? And he was willing to endure that. And so to go from that into like a more normal functional life, again, is a transition that I still don't appreciate.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like you mentioned, there are some people who just thrive on that routine and that they enjoy, like, okay, this is what I do every single day. I have this many grams of rice with this many almonds, and I mobilize from this time to this time, and I train, and I have my bedtime alarm, and like, don't touch it, right? Just let me do that over and over again.
Yeah, yeah. I am not a person who thrives on a routine that rigid, but clearly there are people, and God bless them. They like make great athletes.
Totally right. And it's, I won't say it's necessary to be a high level athlete, because I have coached some folks who, have been pretty good at stuff who aren't like that at all, but a lot of them really are.
Yeah. Yeah. And, again, it's interesting. I don't know Noah Olson that well, and I'm curious. That hasn't been my sense of him. And so it's good to know, that sports can accommodate a wide range of personality types.
Yeah, totally. Your personality type probably has less to do with your performance than, your ability to pump blood to your muscles, to regenerate creatine phosphate, and to just not get tired. It doesn't matter where your personality knobs are turned that much.
Yeah, just your fucking genetics. Right?
Totally.
Lest we forget that component.
Yeah, totally. Cool. So it sounds like this book is a combination of like some very practical stuff, like, hey, here's literal workouts. Here's what I actually did, coupled with actually, revealing some of the whatever emotions, ups, downs, whatever of, years of being the best in the world at a very challenging sport.
Yeah. And the mantra of CrossFit is infinitely scalable. And so I'm proud. I think that the book is accessible to a very wide range. I think that elite people will get something out of it. I think that if you are intimidated by CrossFit and have never tried it, that you can also, work your way through it. You'll probably a little bit more gradually. And so I think it reflects the community well. I think it reflects Matt well. And I'm excited that it's coming out.
Yeah. And what's the process for this? Was it just like you interviewing him? Like, hey, like what happened here? Tell me about this. Were you ever secretly hurt and you didn't tell anyone? Oh, you were interesting. Like, let me write that one down.
Yeah, since we've worked together for 4 years, I had a lot of tape already. But then, we spent like 4 days in Cookeville, Tennessee, in his house doing nothing but just fucking chatting, chatting about his getting sober when he was, a pretty young kid, and then talking about these injuries, his weightlifting career, his relationship with Sammy. I got to do a workout in his home gym, which was the fucking best. And so, it was that's like the part of reporting and writing that I like the most, right? It's just like talking to someone who's passionate about what they've done. And so it was a dream come true for sure.
Yeah, totally. What I mean, I guess what are the things other than like the secret injuries and all that? What else are people going to find out? I mean, you can't give away all the secrets.
No, we can't give it away, can we? I think I will leave it at that. People should check it out. Okay. It is yeah, it'll be out January 4th through Penguin Random House.
Yeah, that's exciting. I look forward to seeing it, to reading it, to learning from it. So Spenser, what else? I mean, we got voting rights. You have a newsletter. How do people subscribe to that?
It's Substack. It's Spenser Super Tuesday. That is just about voting rights. If people want to chat about CrossFit, I would say find me on Twitter at Spenser Mestel, or on Instagram at Spenser Mestel. Other than that, I'm a freelancer, so I'm going to be in DEF CON, the DEF CON like hacker conference in August, looking at voting machines for Vice, which I'm very excited about. And just kind of writing things here and there for various outlets. So if you want to follow my work, would obviously love that. Check me out on Twitter. My website is spencermestel.com. It all ends up there eventually as well.
Yeah, and you tend to share the pieces that you write for various outlets in your newsletter as well, right?
Yeah, all the voting stuff will end up there. And, the Voting rights shit is sad. I'm not going to say that it's not. So the newsletter really goes out of its way to try and look at both sides, what's going well, what's not, trying to give people some practical actions to take, if they do feel fired up. And so it's pretty voiced, which I think is just a good way to absorb this news. Otherwise, it's a little bit overwhelming. There needs to be some levity, or it just kind of crushes us into despair.
I mean, I'm a regular reader of your newsletter, and I would say that I do not usually feel despair when reading it. I'm like, oh, this is helpful and informative. I'm happy that I'm reading this. Is usually how I feel.
Oh man, music to my ears. Thank you.